he encountered a dozen men that he ended up baptizing that only knew John's baptism. We're not told for sure, but it makes sense that these individuals might have known Apollos and been converted, you might say, through Apollos, because that's what Apollos was teaching previously there also in Ephesus. And so apparently these are some men that Paul encountered a little later on. And we're not told specifically that Apollos was baptized again, but these 12 men were. And so it only makes logical sense that Apollos was as well. Because if it was necessary for them to be baptized again, then I think it makes sense that Apollos would have been too. And so also, Paul, while there at Ephesus, began preaching in the synagogue. And after a while of that, he met some resistance in that. And so he decided then on to speak in the Hall of Tyrannus, which was a center of learning there in Ephesus. And he spoke there for about 2 years. The result of that is that all of Asia heard about Paul's teaching about Jesus, and the world knew about Jesus from that. Ephesus was a major city in what we would call Southeast Asia, and in what would be the modern nation of Turkey. That it is an area that people came in and out of, and for that it was a very prominent area. And so Paul, being stationed there, if you will, was a very strategic thing as far as the truth goes, as far as the gospel goes. And it was really important for us to see that. And it is, it's really good to see that, here Paul is having this great work here in Ephesus. When you remember way back in the beginning of the second missionary journey, Paul was forbidden by the Spirit of God to go into Asia. And at the time, he sees the vision of the man from Macedonia, and he goes over and goes to Philippi and in Thessalonica, and then on down to Athens and Corinth. And to see that, it wasn't a matter of God not wanting the gospel to go to Asia. The timing wasn't right. And when God's timing became right for him to be in Ephesus, then it was a very good place. It was probably in looking at it, it was probably the highlight time of the Apostle Paul's ministry, was his years in Ephesus. It was so great, we saw last week, and still reviewing, remember in verses 11 and following, that things were the Spirit was so powerful there, and the extraordinary miracles for Paul being taken care of, so that even Paul's linen objects that Paul touched, like they were either handkerchiefs or aprons that Paul had touched, would be taken to sick people and they would be made better. And so that the most amazing of all of Paul's miracles were done there in Ephesus. The town was really being changed. And not only that town, but all of Asia was being changed because of Paul's time there. And so it's a great, great example of God, when Paul wanted to go into Asia back in the early part of the second missionary journey, and the Spirit kept him from doing it. For whatever reason, the timing wasn't right. And sometimes it's that way. That something may be right and good, but the timing isn't right. And God in His wisdom understands that. It's why sometimes we pray for things that are right and good, and they don't happen when we want them to. And we may think, okay, this is such a good thing, this is a right thing, and we're convinced it's the good and right thing, and God may even agree with us, but the timing isn't what is within His plan. And so I see this, as being a great example of that. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind, is that oftentimes even things that are good and right may have a different time frame based on what God wants than what we want. And so we've got to do our best, pray our hardest, and let the results be what God takes care of. And even in ministry, even in such things as preaching and teaching the truth, converting people or whatever, that there's God's timing is what matters. And so because Paul did it the way God wanted, a very productive 3 years is what Paul is able to spend in the city of Ephesus. We also saw how that there were the 7 sons of Sceva, who was a high priest of the synagogue there, that they performed exorcisms, and they were itinerant at it. They were charlatans, hucksters, and they took on what Paul was doing as a magic formula, so to speak, and they said, I adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preaches, just in case they got a mistake and obey another Jesus, and the demon looks at him and says, looks at the 7 of them and says, I know Jesus and Paul I've heard of, but who are you? And then unleashes a whipping on all 7 of them, and they all go out humiliated, beaten up, and naked. And the whole city hears about it, and what happens? More people convert, more people turn to God, and they bring together a big pile of their books dedicated to their magic arts and to the things that they're doing, and they pile up this pile of books, and they burn them, and they say the worth of that is around 50,000 pieces of silver, a lot of money. Books are always valuable, but books in a day and time where the only way to reproduce books is to handwrite them. Books are always, like I say, books are always valuable, but if you had to handwrite every book that you had, we'd probably all have less books. Books were extremely, extremely valuable because of that. And to have a copy of a book, probably a lot of these books, now of course they were dedicated to dark arts, they were wicked books, but a lot of these books are probably unique. One copy or very few copies of them would have been, as far as scholarship, very, very valuable in that day and time, and certainly today. But that didn't matter, because they represented and they promoted what was wrong and what was evil. And they piled them up and they burned them. And what happens is, in verse 20, the word of the Lord continued and increased and prevailed mightily. Everything is working together in a good way. Paul is converting people. Paul is teaching in the hall of Tyrannus. People are coming to him. And then these hucksters, these charlatans of exorcists, they're actually doing Paul's work for him, because their failure shows his authenticity and results in even more people coming. The darkness that they're doing just gives attention greater to the light. Shows that Paul is genuine, that Paul's true, and that not just anybody can do what Paul's doing. And so the church grows even more, and more people turn to the Lord. In verse 21 and following is where we'll be today. We got into this a little bit last week. There is, in verse 23, there's no little disturbance. Remember reading that last week? And that's kind of the language that Greek often uses. There was no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, made silver shrines to Artemis. And as we noted, there were very common artifacts. The silver shrines of Artemis are primarily two different kinds. One of them being the huntress of a woman with a bow. There's also one of a silver one of a woman that looks like she has many breasts, and that's what they are. She is a goddess of fertility and a goddess of beauty, and so Diana was one that if you went down to Ephesus and you were a pagan, you brought home with you a silver shrine of Artemis. It was kind of like it was the thing to do, and so people would do that. It's for that reason that as far as antiquity artifacts, there's quite a few of those out there, and so because there are so many made. And so here's a man who's a silversmith who handles the silver that gets made into these silver shrines made to Artemis or to Diana. As Artemis is her Greek name, Diana is her Roman name. The King James, when the text, the Receptus that the King James is translated from, they took and they put it into Latin, first of all, which was the language of the Roman Empire. And then they translated it back into Greek, and when they did so, they kept the Roman names. And so the King James has a Roman influence from the Roman Catholic Church in it, and that's where it shows up. The King James uses the Roman names, which is the Diana, whereas most of the other translations follow the Greek names that would have been in the Greek text, and that is Artemis. And so you find that when it's talking about the mythological gods in the book of Acts. And so Artemis and Diana are the same individual, just depending on whether you're looking at it from a Roman or a Greek perspective. But anyway, Paul is upsetting the economy because they are struggling because of what Paul's doing. And this is what we ended with last week, the statement that Demetrius made. In verse 25, these he gathered together with the workmen and the similar trades and said, and that's when I said he got all the teamsters together, got all the union bosses together that are over all the workmen and the tradesmen and the craftsmen and all the group. And he says in verse 25, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. And when you look at this, and this is the final thought I gave to you last week, is that I think it's ironic that he brings up the impact on the economy, and also it may impact our worship of her. That his focus was what it meant to he and the other tradesmen, and then secondarily what it might be reflecting upon their goddess that they worshipped. And so His bigger concern, I guess you might say he's tipping his hand, his bigger concern is the economy, his pocketbook. And in all honesty, the vast majority of people that get a chance to vote with their pocketbook and not anything else. And that's certainly the truth. And so this is what he's most concerned about. And what is the accusation he's laying against the Apostle Paul? That gods made with hands are not gods. And what would Paul say to such a thing? Guilty. If that's what you're saying or accuse me of, that's exactly it. Demetrius gets it. What would Paul say? But he's warped in his thinking. He understands what Paul's saying. Paul's message is getting out loud and clear. Demetrius gets this chunk of silver is something manipulated by man. You remember, those of you that are here on Wednesday night and have been looking at our in Hebrews chapter 3, we were talking a couple weeks ago about how that Moses was faithful in God's house. But yet Christ was the builder of God's house and over God's house. And he makes the assertion, who's greater, the builder or the house? Well, or the one, well, it's the same with these gods. Who is greater? The mind that creates the statue or the statue itself? I mean, it's ridiculous. You can take and make a beautiful silver statue. And you can take a hammer to it and destroy it. But if you are the craftsman that built it, you know what you can do? You can recast it, make another one. You can maybe even use the same silver. Just melt it down and redo whatever you did. So who is greater? The God that created everything or what is created? Well, obviously the God that creates it. And so the human beings, they are worshiping something that either they or another human being made. If you have to pick up your God to carry it, what help is that? If you have to pick up your God, if your God falls off the shelf, do you have to put it back up there? If your God gets dusty, do you have to dust it off? If your God is that incapable, then, what have you got? We don't have anything. And so, it's rather silly to think. And of course, the prophets talked about that on different occasions. Jeremiah and some of the others. And Jeremiah even one point says, you cut down a tree and you take part of the tree and make firewood with it. You take another part and build a chair, and then you take another part and make an idol out of it and bow down from it and say, this is my God. All out of the same tree. Just ridiculous to think of that. The same way with this silver. You can make a spoon, you can make an idol, which, and it makes no sense. And so Demetrius is making this accusation, and so he stirs up the people. Verse 28, when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Boy, that's the definition of a riot, isn't it? Some are yelling one thing, some are yelling another, and most don't know why it's going on. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. And when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there that does not know the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men that were neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen have with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, there are proconsuls, and let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in a regular assembly, for we are really in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." When he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. In danger of rioting, after 2 hours of yelling, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," or Artemis. And so they probably long past rioting. But anyway. I can't imagine, for 2 hours yelling and chanting that. And that would have been amazing. The first minute or two would have been kind of something to behold, but after 2 hours, I think even the most ardent follower would have been tired of that.
The biggest problem was there was no Walmart there to loot.
Yeah, there was no Walmart to loot. Yeah, so they just hung out there and yelled. Yeah. Yep. So you have all of this going on, and you've got these people that are the whole city is stirred up.
It always amazed me though that, they were all about making these statues and stuff like this. And why didn't they jump on the other bandwagon? It's, okay, well, we talking about this Jesus. Let's start making statues of Jesus.
Yeah. Of course, Paul would have been against that, but yeah, why didn't they see a money-making opportunity of doing such a thing? So, yeah. But that is interesting that they didn't, but they were still focused on Artemis. Oh yeah. And that's a great example, Janet. Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and the crowd are crying out in praise of him. It's a week later that many of the same crowd undoubtedly are shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." In fact, a lot of times, a mob mentality is one of the least intelligent things you'll find because of that group mentality like that. So, because people just get wrapped up in it and don't even know what they're talking about. And this shows it. There were some that didn't even know why they were there, but hey, there's everybody yelling, why not join in? And so, great example of that.
What a great example is why we can use this book to guide our lives today. Because, again, there's nothing different in this situation as what we see what's going on today. As much as you'd like to think these are intelligent people who gather together, but again, they're not. They're not intelligent people who gather together to argue against what's going on in their society. And much as you'd hate to disagree with it and stuff, but Randy's right. There's no Walmart back then. So, but I mean, these people are just going along with the crowd. And the same thing that's happening today. These people aren't, weighing the facts. They're not looking at what's right and wrong. They're just going with the crowd. Whoever
Right.
has the loudest voice.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
that's how it was back then, and that's how it is again today.
Right. Yeah, definitely true. And so very little of politics today is about the issues. It's about how bad the other candidate is. And there's plenty of bad to go around. But it's a shame that it's not about the issues that face our country, because we got a bunch of them. We got a pile of issues. Yeah.
You know, us repeating ourselves over and over again and not see how this can guide
Oh
us
yeah.
the right way.
Yeah. And see how that as wicked a town as Ephesus was, the idolatry and the wickedness of Ephesus when Paul entered the city was probably on a scale beyond anything that we have in our nation. But yet now here it is. I mean, the town's set upside down. You know, they've already had this massive book burning. There's everybody in town and everybody in the whole region. It says all of Asia came. I mean, all of the area. Now, when it says all of Asia, it's not the same technical Asia that we think of, because that includes China and India and a whole bunch of other places that aren't specifically a part of what was Asia then. But a lot of people have heard the truth because of Paul and what's going on here. And, you know, a massive impact has taken place. And it shows that the truth can set things right, even in a very hostile environment. And as bad as things are in our world today, the light's still light. In fact, in the darkest part, in the darkest night, the light shines the brightest. And in the first century, I mean, you look at Paul's ministry, all these missionary journeys. One of the biggest reasons why Paul moves from place to place is because he has met with serious opposition. And we're not necessarily met with serious opposition on a daily basis in the church, in our country. And as much as we might think about the current state of things in our nation, we're not running from our lives from city to city like Paul was at times. And I'm not hoping that ever happens. I hope that never happens in our nation.
That's because
We're not looked at as a threat.
If we were, we'd see opposition.
Well, that's kind of where I'm rolling with this, is that maybe we're not having the impact that Paul had. In fact, definitely we're not having the impact that Paul had. When the enemy preaches your sermon for you, you know you're doing a good job. Because you get it. He says, Paul is going around saying that gods made with hands aren't gods. That's the accusation being made. That's a pretty good sermon in Ephesus in that day and time. You know, that's a pretty good solid point. You know, if your enemy can preach your sermon for you and do it accurately, then you're doing a really good job. And so that is what's going on. And so the city is riding the leader of the city. Calms them down, sends them out, the town clerk, and says, we've got courts, we've got proconsuls, basically like judges. They can hear the cases. We can do this in a civil manner. If you want to sue this person, go ahead. They can sue you back. We'll handle it there. Let's get this out of the streets. And they do. And he dismisses the assembly. And it goes away. It is an amazing example of what can happen when light and dark clash. And that certainly did happen there. We are so adverse to confrontation. We like it when everybody likes us and speaks well of us. But look at what people thought of Paul in Ephesus. You either thought Paul was the best thing to come to Ephesus or the worst thing to come to Ephesus. If you were John Q. citizen of Ephesus in that day and time, just, I guess in our thing it's Joe the plumber, like from a previous election. If you're just the average Joe in Ephesus, and you thought about Paul, you either thought he was the best thing to happen to Ephesus or the worst thing to happen to Ephesus. Probably depending on whether you were a part of the union or not. In the silversmith and craftsman union or whatever, whether your economy was upset or not, probably depends on whether or not you were a part of that. And so, let's get real. If we were to knock on all the doors in Barrackville, would we be at the top of the list of the best thing in Barrackville, or would we be at the top of the list of the worst thing in Barrackville? People would say, well, it's good to have churches. Just something to think about. We probably don't have such a strong reaction, I would gather, on the community. And I would say that's not unique to Barrackville. I'd say you go anywhere around our nation and you knock on the doors of houses, you probably are not going to find that such a strong reaction. And maybe it's, as Mick said a little while ago, we're not such a threat to changing the world as we maybe used to be or should be. Yeah? And of course, Demetrius isn't very receptive. And so that's kind of my thought is you either converted or you were absolutely opposed to. Yeah, there wasn't much ambivalence. There wasn't much lukewarmness in all of it. You were on one side or the other. And so, undoubtedly, there are going to be people that viscerally, completely dislike us. They hated Jesus. They killed him on the cross. And so we shouldn't think that everybody's going to think warm and fuzzy thoughts about us. Some people are going to hate us because that's how they are. If nobody hates us, maybe we're not being like Christ. Because they hated him, and he said to his disciples that they're going to hate you because they hated me. He said that in John 14, right? Or in 14, 15, and 16. He says 2 or 3 different statements along those lines in the Last Supper with his disciples that, they persecuted me, they hated me, they're going to do these things to you, the same. And that's all part of being a Christian. So.
Small community like Barrackville, where everyone knows everyone else, and even Marion County, if you want to extrapolate maybe out there. We all have friends, members of denominations.
Oh, yeah.
And if we told the pure, unvarnished truth of what the gospel is, they would have to be forced to examine what they believe, and they would present us, and even as friends. That's, I think, boils it down to why maybe we're not as aggressive.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be mean or nasty about it, but very often, and I don't think you're suggesting that at all, but. Right.
So I'm not gonna, I no longer want to associate with you, I dislike you because you're hurting my feelings.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they don't resent you, they resent what's coming out of your mouth.
Exactly.
True. Yeah.
So it's coming out of your mouth, who they're gonna blame? The words? They can't blame the words, they're gonna blame you.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
why you have to take on an attitude of, look, I'm not here to hurt you, I'm not here to slam you, I'm here because I'm concerned about you. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Yeah. As more and more denominations veer further and further away from the truth, those that try to follow the truth will be in greater contrast to those that are whatever, following whatever. You know, a great example of that is this, you know, the whole thing that's happened in the last year or so with gay marriage, that, you know, some religious entities have gone the path of saying, you know, that's okay. And others have not. And that's a pretty stark line of demarcation, because more and more there's going to be more that follow after that path. And as that happens, those that, you know, cling to, you know, the Bible and following the Bible itself are going to be in a greater contrast with what we would think of as the majority of society. You know, we have already come to a point where the majority of Americans don't go to church anymore. That aren't affiliated. There are more unchurched Americans than people that identify as a member of a congregation. And that's in the broadest sense of the term. And so, when the majority of Americans don't have a church, no matter how wide-eyed and liberal they are, if they don't have any church influence in their life, then it makes perfect sense that the moral compass of America looks more like a ceiling fan. You know, where does it point? Where does the moral compass of America point? It didn't even point toward the Constitution, because there's many that are suggesting we get rid of that. You know, I mean, if you looked at our founding fathers, it would point toward the Bible and the principles of Christianity and point toward the ideals of the Constitution. Well, it doesn't even point that way now. It points basically where the latest poll says. And, honestly, I don't really care sometimes what polls say, because at one point the majority of the world thought that the earth was flat and that the sun revolves around the earth and other crazy things like that. So if you go based on the majority, we learn more things. We have more knowledge than we ever had, but there's a whole lot of things we don't know. Things that God still holds, that God still is in control of. And so, it's a situation where we, and I want to go back to what Linda is saying, we need to stay focused on the book. We need to stay focused in God's Word, because God's Word changes lives today, the same as God's Word changed lives in Ephesus. Brian?
When you talk about right and wrong, and you don't understand, pray for something, timing wouldn't be right.
Uh-huh.
Now, when you have the knowledge, that's the reason we're supposed to pray for wisdom. So we can rightly divide and apply that knowledge in the way that it should be.
Right.
Now, if we have any wisdom, we can see what our democracy is doing, which way it's going, and forget about the Republicans or the Democrats, either one, and just vote for your country.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not as easy said as done,
No, that's right.
considering the way the ballot looks.
Yeah, I'm surprised that the graveyards aren't shaking all over at this point.
Yeah.
Because those people who built this great nation, they followed God.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
We worry about people liking us, and I struggle with this all the time, because I don't care that you don't like me, and I
Well, the one thing I would say to that, Linda, is do what is within you best to respect them. You may think that their ideas are the craziest things you ever heard, but, being respectful of them, in this text, the town clerk said of Paul that he's not saying anything of a nature that is blasphemous or whatever against their God. Now, of course, he's teaching the truth, which means that their God isn't a God. But even he was not, you may say, even blasphemous against Diana or Artemis, but yet, he was preaching the truth, and the truth will shine against the darkness. And it is important that we respect people, even if we don't respect what they're saying and doing. We need to make sure that we reach out and love as best we can to the individuals. For instance, I am about as opposed to our current president, policy-wise, on most every major issue as you can find. But if I got a one-on-one meeting with our president, I would be respectful of him with his office. I would be respectful of him as a man. I wouldn't resort to name-calling or anything like that. But if I got my moment, I've got a few issues I'd like to talk to him about. But I would try to do it, and I can't say I'd be perfect at it, but I would try to be as honest and truthful and respectful and not back from the facts as I could, and bring up things that I think have taken us in a bad direction. And that's what we need to do with our friends, our neighbors, that believe other things than we do. That we should try to treat them with decency and respect, even if we think their idea is the craziest thing we ever heard. We need to love them. And,
On November the 8th, you'll have the opportunity to have a meeting with him, to stop his policies as your representative.
probably so.
Because they will be continued right on down.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thanks.